Today we're going to talk about the generations and about bridging the generation gaps. Before we were meeting this morning, I was talking with Glenn a little bit and with Chuck a little bit, and we were sharing things that had happened overseas. But for this little section of our time together, I want to bring us home, here, to our member groups, to the generations that make up our member groups, and to what shaped them and us here in the U.S. Because when it comes to being in our groups together now, this culture and the history of this culture had such a shaping effect on the members who look to you to be invited in and to be engaged. As I was thinking about this and thinking about the work we do in the world and for the world as different generations, I remembered something that happened about 15 years ago, just off the edge of Vanderbilt campus at a restaurant. I was sitting there with a big client having dinner. Big client, good client, very conservative client. Yeah, so I was on my good behavior. And as we were sitting there having dinner, I explained to her about my daughter, who was 16. Jean is her name. Jean is an incredible activist. Always a cause. Homelessness, hunger, the environment. I'm so proud of her. And as I told my conservative client about her, I gave her the Facebook version, all the good stuff about that. And as the meal went on, everything went well, and we were waiting on a check, and it was time for me to call and check in on Jean. Picked up my phone, checked in on Jean. What you doing? She said one word: diving. You know what she was doing? Yeah, dumpster diving, that's right. She and some other volunteers from a food kitchen were waiting behind restaurants, hoping to intercept unsold food before it hit the dumpster, or shortly thereafter. I think there was a 5-second rule in play, I'm not sure. But this was typical of Jean. But on that night, as I sat there, I had this flash of parental intuition, I just knew that she was behind the very restaurant where we were. I just knew it. I also knew that the client and I had parked behind the restaurant pretty darn close to that dumpster. Sure enough, I had to be an adult, stand up, go around back where we saw my tattooed daughter with a ring in her nose, who was not in the dumpster per se, okay, but she was boosting somebody else up. Jean was an activist, and I admired that and loved that about her to this day. But she did get arrested a couple of times. It's kind of awkward. I got to know the guys down at juvie fairly well. And one time I went down and one of them said, she's so persuasive. Is she thinking about law for a career? I was thinking, no, I think she's committed to dumpster diving to make a living. So, living with an activist isn't easy. Maybe some of your partners and spouses have told you that. Yeah, sometimes we know that, don't we? But I tell you what, I did not see all this in generational terms until one time when I dropped Jean off. Now remember, she's a millennial and I'm a boomer. I dropped her off for a peace vigil over here at Scarrett campus, right across the way. And as she got out of the car, she said to me, "Mom, I'm so excited. This is going to be so successful, and I helped organize it." She said, "After today, I'm really excited. I think I might have an FBI file just like you." Well, I went, "Just like me? What? What are you talking about, just like me?" No, that was the 60s. That was different. I was convinced of it. But I had to look into it to know why I had that reaction. And as I began to study the generations more and more, I began to find out that she and her generation, they do want to do good work in the world. They do good work in the world, but they do it differently. Whereas we boomers were more in terms of sweeping movements and vast changes. They were more surgical, more practical, more focused. They don't want to teach the world to sing so much as they just want to fix it. Just make it work. There is a difference. She and I share values, core values, but there is a difference in how we play that out. And today, for just a few minutes, let's look at those differences among the generations and how they play out in your member groups. Okay, just get that big picture, looking at the generations briefly through the lens of history. Right now, as you know, people are living longer, we're working longer, and we've got more and more generations crammed into our member groups and into all the institutions, into our workplaces, into all the areas where we come together. And so not to plan for all those generations is just to plan to fail. That's the bottom line these days. And if you tweet, anybody out there tweeting? Here's the handle. Let's do it. Let's make it alive. Thank you very much. I remember I was been a speaker for a long time, and I remember the first time somebody was tweeting it, or I thought they were texting, and I said, I don't mind if you text. I know that you can pay attention and text at the same time. We all have to do that these days. She said, I'm tweeting. And I was like, I knew I had made it. I thought, this is great. Technology's is finally in my favor. Let's see who's in the room today. Silent. So people born between 27 and 46. Anybody in the silent generation? Woohoo! All right. Thank you for the legacy you give us in so many ways, and for the good work that continues. For the good work that continues. Thank you. What about baby boomers, born between 46 and 64? Yeah, a bunch of us here. Got a surfeit of boomers, it looks like. What about Gen Xers? Pretty good here. Oh, I'm sorry. Gen Xers are born between 65 and 1980.
Okay.
Gen Xers, we have a pretty good representation of Gen Xers. That's fantastic. Now, Gen Xers, notice the representation of the room went down a little bit, but the representation of Xers in the culture is down a little bit too. It's a smaller generation than previous generations. You're kind of squeezed between the huge millennial generation and the huge boomer generation, and they're the Xers. You Xers grew up in the most interesting time in history. You saw everything. You guys were old enough to remember, some of you old enough to remember one president saying, I am not a, and another president saying, I did not have. Yeah. You were just right in that bracket. What? I'm sorry? Yeah. So anyway, you saw all that as Xers. You lived through a very interesting time in history. We're going to talk about that. Millennials in the room, born between 80 and 95. Oh, good. Not many of you. Might have to scoot together and sort of take care of each other, but millennials, there are just a few of you in the room today, but that's going to change. It's already changing, as you know. By 2020, half the people in the workforce will be millennials. By 2025, millennials are going to not just outnumber everybody, but out-earn everybody. By 2030, the first millennials will get their AARP cards, So the millennials are coming right along. This next generation, people who are 19 and under, are being called either Homelanders or Gen Edge. And they're a fascinating generation. But since we probably don't have them in our associations, we won't talk too much about them today. Let's start, as we do this generational survey, with that silent generation. You guys who are silent, you've been called by generational theorists pathologically positive. Does that fit?
No.
All right. Let's make something clear. As we talk about the generations, we're talking about the generations as a group. We're talking about a sociological study, not an individual psychological study. Right. There are all sorts of variations within each group. We're just going to talk about the fact that if we grew up at roughly the same time in history and experienced many of the same conditions and many of the same events, then it does tend to shape our expectations about things. And it shapes the way that we feel about institutions and authority and rules. So that's sort of where we're coming from today, is not that all individuals fit into these categories, and we're not trying to put people in boxes, but simply to say it does shape us in big, overarching ways that we want to be aware of as we invite people into our member groups. Okay, silence. Pathologically positive has been the label that generational theorists have given this group. Now, one thing that silence experienced, and you help me with this, is an ability to be positive because institutions tended to work for this group. Government had won World War II. Government, Social Security was considered, it was going to work. Businesses tended to work and to survive when silents were coming into the workplace. Do you know where the silent name came from for this generation? It was during the McCarthy era. This generation did not speak up, and so Time magazine named them the silents because they were more or less satisfied to just kind of watch things play out rather than speaking up. Well, that's typical of the period of history in which they were born. When we look at generational theory, we see that generations run in cycles, and the silent generation was born in a time when institutions were powerful, institutions tended to work. And it worked for this generation. It simply worked. But if you believe in institutions strongly, a couple of things. You tend to assume that there's a good and a standard way of doing things, and that works. And that's a natural assumption. Nothing wrong with that. You assume there's a standard way of doing things. If you believe in institutions and institutions are working for you, whether it's the government or the Rotary Club or your school or all these groups basically are working for you, then another thing you assume is that there's a right way to communicate. Because when institutions are strong, we know historically that we tend to fall into patterns of communication that are top-down, military, command and control communication. Makes sense. Works. Works for that period of history. You know this kind of communication. If the boss says jump, you say, I'm sorry? Yeah. But you millennials in the room, if I say jump to you, what are you going to say? Why? Yeah, everybody knows the answer to that question. Why? One time I was in Canada and I said that to the room and this millennial in the back said, screw you! I'm not kidding. There's always that response of why. It becomes a conversation, not an instruction to be obeyed. It becomes a conversation with millennials. That's a vast and powerful generational difference. It plays out in the way that you organize and run your member groups. If you don't allow for that conversation, the millennials are not going to engage. They're just going to feel, like, hey, I don't belong here. And they're going to come in, volunteer, bounce out again. So that's a fundamental generational difference. Now, one way that I like to get my head around this is with a visual, and that is simply to look at the world as I knew it as a baby boomer when I went into the workplace as I was growing up. This is how it worked. My school worked this way, my church worked this way, my workplace worked this way. And it worked. But that's exactly what I expected no matter where I went. Where's the power, the authority to make decisions? We're on this chart. Sure, the top. Where's all the information kept? At the top, sure. Another thing that matters here is that experience matters a lot. Age can matter a lot. But now fast forward to my daughter's generation. The whole world changed. The way we communicated changed. The way we organized and got things done changed. So they went to work and they began to look at not just their workplace, but all the organizations and the associations and the groups they belong to. They began to look at them and think, doesn't it work more like this? A vast and profound generational difference. Where's the decision-making ability? It's shared, isn't it? Where's the power? It's shared. Where's the information? Shared. If the organization works like this, experience may not matter that much. Speed matters. Relationship matters. Information matters. Here's what's hard. Your member group looks like this. This is why it's hard, not just for your member groups, but for all nonprofits and for-profits and businesses. We're all living in a half-changed world where there are generations who think, no, we're going to get it done this way. And other generations thinking, no, we're going to get it done this way. It's going to be linear. There are different ways of getting things done. People coming to your group is making different assumptions about the value of the group to begin with. Different assumptions about how communication is going to be done, about how meetings are going to be run, about how decisions are going to be made. All of these come into play. It's no wonder if you're thinking, man, we are getting one generation or another. They're just not staying with us or coming to us. Then think about situations where these two very different models are in play. And it's a hard time to be alive. It is. It is a hard time to run a member group because we have to respond to both of these models of communication. Questions, comments? Have you seen this play out? How have you seen it play out? An example? Yeah.
I can say in our group, we had a silent generation as president of the group for a number of years. And last year, we had a millennial elected as president of the organization.
You went from a silent to a millennial as the president? Woo!
And our millennial started doing things, and the past silent generation president kept saying, well, but we do things this way, and we had to keep reminding her that that's the way we've done things. That doesn't mean that's the way things have to be done.
And some of this is just human nature. Some of it is generational.
Yep.
Because if you're a silent or a boomer, it is easy to assume there's a standard and a right way of doing it. And the millennial comes in and goes, no, there are 42 ways to get that done.
Yep.
Wow. It's a conflict. It is. I was working with a law firm not long ago, and I got so tickled because they were sitting in a group sort of like you're sitting, and the president was sitting up front, and this guy, I said, have you seen an example of this? And the guy in the back said, yes. He said, we got a memo from the president about professional dress. Okay, that's the top-down model, right? So the guy in the back says, so I thought this won't work. Guess what generation he is? Millennial. He thought it was a conversation, right? He thought it was a conversation. So he makes a bunch of comments on the email, and then he hits reply all. Yeah. Completely different model. Two models butting heads. Both people meant well. When he said that in the back, the president, who had a great sense of humor, he was sitting in the front, he looked back, he said, are you still here? I thought we fired you. It was great. And that's a firm that is engaging all the generations because they are willing to have those conversations and to recognize the value in both models. Another example of when these two things, yes, sir, in the back there.
Members don't come to you for information.
That's right.
They expect you to reach out to them and do it in different ways.
Yes, and are you talking about people working on this model?
Yeah, I mean, when you want to get your word out, you got to use your newsletter, Facebook, Twitter,
Yeah.
Word of mouth.
Yeah.
Do some phone calls to get the leaders involved.
Because they're not coming and petitioning for information, not at all. They're not expecting this flow, they're expecting this. You reach them, they reach to you. Is that what you're saying? Yes. So you have to go at them with a whole lot of very different ways, like you said. Blogs, newsletters, text, whatever. You've got to get a bunch of Twitter. You've got to get a bunch of stuff going so that you reach everybody. And maybe some of those ways are very traditional ways. Maybe it's your newsletter. Maybe some of those other ways are non-traditional, and they're a Twitter feed, so that everybody keeps up with what's going on. Yes?
So what I'm kind of an aha moment is I'm a generation older. So
You're an extra. You're right in the middle.
So I'm in the middle. So I've been bridging, I guess, the generation gap in my group between millennials and
Yes.
the silent and
And the boomers?
yeah, baby boomers. But what I find is how can you're going to give recommendations because it's the communication with the online is so essential, but there's a threat of learning this new way of online technology that is threatening
Yes.
to a lot of people within the silent. And
I can tell you, I'm a boomer. It is
boomer,
threatening.
you
It
know,
is.
And so
Yeah.
it's intimidating.
Yes,
you
it
know,
is.
for a lot of people within other generations. So, and the millennials and even Generation X, or sometimes it's disparaging because there's this, no, we're not going to do it. No, it's just off limits. But then when you get to the bottom line, it's just they're threatened. They
Of
don't
course.
want to learn Facebook. They don't want to learn. You know, it's just too much. It's too overwhelming.
Yes, and one of my recommendations when we talk about the boomers is going to keep it from being too much and to set some parameters for that. Absolutely. But let me take one more comment and then go on. I'm sorry, there were several hands.
I'm
But
sorry.
yes.
Yeah.
Right here, the lady with her hand.
Thank you. I just want to say something in defense of boomers.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Because my frustration is that it seems to me sometimes that the emphasis on the medium, on the social media, is an emphasis on just that, on the medium, rather than on the content.
It
And
can be. Yes, it really can be. And
Well, I
as
know,
boomers,
my generation came up with that, the medium is the message. But in fact, it's not.
yes,
I mean, in my last, I'm retired now, but my last assignment, I worked for the State Department. I was back in Washington, and I was just overwhelmed with the number of 25-year-olds. And this was about 5 years ago, so I don't know what generation they are. But they were in their 20s at the time, now they're early 30s.
that's first run millennial, front edge millennials.
Okay. They seem to care more about getting it out on social media. and they didn't necessarily understand what they were getting out.
And that, when you say that, then I hear your generational bias there, just as I heard your generational bias there. Notice this is hard stuff, and thank you. Man, I wish I had a photo of that. Shaking hands across the table. These are the conversations we have to have, and it is hard. This stuff, like I said, we live in a hard time. Generational theorists will tell you we live in a time that is called crisis. This is a period of crisis in generational theory, when old ways of communicating, old ways of organizing, old ways of coming together and being who we are and doing good in the world get reborn and reshaped. And that's hard. It'll be easier, let me just give you a little, it'll be easier in 15 years. We'll be back into a period that they call a high. And it'll be sort of like the silent generation in a way. They may not be silent, but things will be a little settled for a while. Just some helpfulness. Let me run, I see you.
Yeah, just one comment.
Yes.
It's really time consuming to have to deal with the multiple
Yes, it is.
ways of communicating.
Yes, it is.
Extremely time consuming.
And therefore, when it comes to that technology, like I said, one of my recommendations is you must set clear parameters. This committee will work in this way. We will not have all-day email conversations with everybody so that I have to read 16 reams of stuff when I get home from work and try to figure out what the heck is going on. We're not going to decide it that way. We're going to decide it this way. We're going to use email only for this, and we will decide this face-to-face. Or this is a minor conversation. Everybody feed in your stuff, and then one person will pull it, work with a couple other people and make that decision. You have to tame that technology, or else it's a mess. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about boomers. This is, of course, as we have hinted at already, a time of very high ideals. It was a time when the silence was broken and you found a voice. A time when institutions were challenged and, again, ideals rose to the surface. Leaders were visionary. And so when boomers began to get things done, we didn't necessarily assume that there was a standard way of doing it. We want to do them our way. Not necessarily a standard, like the silence had said, but more like there was an ideal way, there was a right way, because we were idealistic. Boomers were so idealistic that when we went to college, and we were surveyed as freshmen, we said it's much more important to have a meaningful philosophy of life than to have financial success. Now, as boomers we go, yeah, duh. But see, the silence had not said that. This was a shift in the culture, a huge shift in the culture. And we all know what was going on, the peace movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement. It was a time of amazing change. The anti-nukes movement, that's where I got my FBI file that my daughter is so proud of still. A time of high idealism, and that has not changed. When you survey boomers today, we all say, the surveys still tell us that we are very, very, as a group, idealistic. Now, that makes sense in generational theories. We grew up during this period that generational theorists call an awakening, and you get very idealistic people who come out of an awakening. But again, what I said a minute ago about idealistic people is we can easily assume there's a right way to do something. That's the flip side of that high and wonderful idealism. And we boomers took that idealism and we drove it right into our work. We drove it right into our volunteer activities. We have been a powerhouse and are a powerhouse with more years to come. But it's easy for us to slip into that idealistic place and say, no, this is right. When in fact the Gen Xer and the Millennial may be saying, yeah, I agree with your values, but couldn't we do it some other way? That's not the only right way to do it. So again, that generational stuff can come to the fore. All right, something else about boomers, nonconformist. Man, I'm looking at a room of nonconformists. You were not only idealistic, you were Peace Corps volunteers, for heaven's sakes. Man, the Peace Corps got the cream of the crop with boomers because the Peace Corps absolutely spoke to that essence of idealism and nonconformity. Beginning with the boomers, unlike the silence, it was good. It was okay to be, Yeah, unhappy. Dissatisfied. Rebellious and vocal about it. Kind of restless. That was okay. It was okay to be different, to be unique, to stand out. And that was different. It was a shift in the culture. As I said, nothing spoke to those traits more strongly or stood for that era and that time and that group of generations more than the Peace Corps did. Now, let's circle back to those idealistic nonconformist members of your group today. What do the boomers in your group need from you? What do you think? What do they need from you today? In order to engage, in order to really be present and to work efficiently and powerfully with your group, what do they need?
To be recognized as they are.
To be recognized, totally. That recognition is huge. We put in our years. It's huge. Besides that, we boomers are always very competitive. There were so many of us. You know, we swamped the school system when we got there. How many boomers went to school and there weren't enough books in the classroom? You remember that? Not enough desks in the classroom. I thought that was normal. I really just thought, it was going to be crowded all my life, and it was. And when we got into the workplace in the 70s, we swamped the workplace too. There weren't enough jobs for us. We're extremely competitive. How do you compete if you're a boomer and you don't have high tech to work with? What do you use to get things done? Words, face-to-face. Those powerful face-to-face abilities, which we have in spades. We didn't have email. We learned how to do meetings. We're good at it. We learned how to read body language from 300 yards. If you're a boomer and you're in this room, you may be able to pick up the phone and hear 3 words from somebody and you know what kind of mood they're in, right? Yeah, because you learn to read tone of voice. It was what we had to work with. You can tell what mood they're in. You can tell what people had for breakfast if you're really good. So that's how we worked. That's how we got things done, was face-to-face. That's part of this resistance to social media, is we know we can get it done face-to-face. And now there are all these other tools for getting it done, and that's where we sometimes butt heads. Okay, I'm sorry, I got off on another tangent. Recognition. It's very important because we were a very competitive and crowded group and had to find ways to stand out. It's recognition for the boomers in your group and what they have achieved and contributed and what they will achieve and contribute is really important. We're the only generation who likes plaques, but we do. You don't see Gen Xers with plaques on their walls. Boomers, hey, give me a plaque, I'm going to put it in my wall. Yeah, we're very big on recognition. Another thing boomers need from your group is a way to prevent burnout. We've been at it for years and years or decades. Then we are going to need some help from other people for preventing burnout and for letting go of what we need to let go of. Now, one thing that you can do with boomers, and I see this working in the nonprofit world and in the for-profit world, is with this final 10 or 7 years or 15 years of volunteer work that we've got left in us, then talk about specific roles for those boomers, specific roles as mentors or coaches for those returning volunteers, specific roles as specialists or troubleshooters, or doing the backroom work, like making sure membership stays up to date. Just doing the specialist, the piece of it that is essential, without letting the boomers take on the universal responsibility for the whole thing, because you know what? That's what we tend to do, because we're idealists. Make sense? Okay. Something else that boomers are going to need is structured collaboration. Now that gets us to the email and to the technology. Tame the technology. Decide how you're going to make decisions, how this or that committee is going to run. And you're going to have to decide that as a group. That's not a conversation, it's not a decision one person can make, that's a conversation that the group has first time they meet to decide how they're going to use the technology. Otherwise, man, you know the mess it can be. But this is a time in history when we have to do that. And we have to do it for the boomers, for everybody. Even millennials are pushing back against too much email. You may have noticed in the news, some big places like Boeing and Deloitte are having no email days. You know who's asking for that? Millennials. Because they too are getting overwhelmed with all the data and all the information. It's the same in our member groups. You got to determine how you're going to feed people information and how you're going to make decisions. Just keep it cleaner for everybody. More central support. I was glad to hear what Glenn was saying about more central support, more things like membership being automatically renewed, because that is a big help to the boomers who've been carrying the member groups in terms of the work for a long time. Okay. A period of awakening is always followed by a different period. Now we're going to talk about Gen X. A period of awakening when ideals rise to the surface and institutions are challenged is always followed by a very different period, a period of unraveling, when institutions start to erode and start to fail. Gen Xers. This is the first generation that had 24/7 news, TV. How many stations did you boomers have growing up at home? 3. 4. Who said you lived in the city?
Public television.
Public television, that's right. But if you lived in the country like I did, you didn't know about public television. It was so exciting when I finally moved to the city. But if you were an Xer, how many stations did you have? You know why nobody's saying anything? It's like 30, 40, 50, who knows? There was an explosion. There was an explosion of information. And we had these hungry channels like CNN, founded in 1981, that were giving us blow by blow by blow everything that happened, all the backstory, the scandals in religion, in education, in government, the whole thing. We heard every tiny step of that. WorldCom, Enron, you know what I'm talking about. We had all of this stuff, which said to Xers, institutions fail. Institutions fail us. And on the business front, on the, all these, there was downsizing, right-sizing. Remember right-sizing? That was a nice euphemism. There were layoffs. Gen Xers saw people in their families who had worked for 20 or 30 years for a company suddenly lose their job. So when this ad, I'm going to show you a quick ad. I'm sorry our sound isn't good, but I'm hoping that you may remember this ad. When this ad came out, it absolutely nailed the attitude of Xers. Let's see what we get.
When I grow up, I want to file all day.
I want to claw my way up to middle management. Be replaced on a whim. A brown nose.
I want to be a yes man.
Yes, woman. Yes, sir. Coming, sir.
Anything for a raise, sir.
When I grow up,
I want to be underappreciated.
be paid less for doing the same job.
I want to be forced into early retirement.
Yeah, not a great attitude to have as a kid, but it was the attitude that helped Xers survive. They became, in fact, very skeptical as a generation. Make sense? Sometimes after I speak, an Xer will come up to me and say, "Oh, I always thought I was just difficult, but it turns out I'm skeptical." The Xer will come to your member group meeting, and they will say, "I don't think that'll work. Are you sure? I don't know, maybe." They're going to ask the hard questions. They're going to push back. They're going to say, just because that worked before doesn't mean we want to do it again. I worked with a wonderful Xer whose name was Kel. I remember one day I drove in, and as I drove in, the traffic was heavy, and I was looking at those signs over the freeway, which I like, because they say only 15 minutes to this exit, or only 7 minutes. So you're kind of reassured. You go, okay, I'm sitting in traffic, but it's only 7 minutes, I'll make it. So I came into work and I said to Kel, those signs really help. You get it. What do you think he said? Yeah, if you believe the signs, he said. Yeah, very skeptical generation. Now, when they come to you and they volunteer, they come in for the first time, or they're on your committee or whatever, and they say, not sure that I can buy that, or not thinking that'll work, or why on earth would you think that? The Gen Xer is engaged. The Gen Xer cares, or they wouldn't ask that question. Yeah. So this is somebody we need on our committees. This is somebody we need in our group. But as boomers, it can be hard to hear that. Make sense? Questions or comments from the back? I see you laughing. What's going on back there?
I believe the signs like you.
Oh, you, well, what the boomers believe the signs. Oh, you believe the signs, but you're a millennial. That's okay. No, are you a millennial or an Xer?
No, she said, so that's why you need me.
Oh, so that's why you need me. That's right. Sometimes there's a Gen Xer in the audience who says, I don't know if we're that skeptical. You know, I believe the signs. I did find one study that spoke to something that Gen Xers believe. Now, something else we need to know about Gen Xers is they are extremely independent as a group. Independent as a group. Like to work on their own. Xers are famous for working on their own. How many of you have had a committee meeting or something, and the boomers are like wanting to do it, you know, you're all working it out, and the Xers is kind of like, just give me that little piece so I can get out of here and go do it, right? So you go away, I'll get the work done. I'm sorry, there was a, yes. Are you relating to that back there in the corner? Yeah. Are you an Xer? Are you an Xer? Yeah. Xers are famous for wanting to work in their caves. Yeah, and sometimes millennials come in and they just have a zillion ideas. They're collaborative, they want to talk about everything, right? And the Xers like, it's like puppies, get down, go away. This happens in our member groups, it happens everywhere. Make sense?
So,
Yes.
that's why millennials are more comfortable with telecommuting. Or working. Gen X rather, I'm sorry, Gen X.
Oh yeah, Gen Xers, first they invented life balance, which we boomers would never have thought of.
Yeah.
Then they invented working from a distance.
Yeah.
And they get it done. They get her done.
Yeah,
Now,
I would never be able to do that.
two things, independence, yeah, we boomers do. Independence and efficiency play into this. Let's talk just a little bit about that. As kids, remember what Gen Xers were called? Latchkey kids. And in fact, 40% of Gen Xers came home to an empty house. 40%. The divorce rate tripled while Gen Xers were growing up. There's another institution that failed while they were growing up. The divorce rate tripled, both parents were working. 50% of Gen Xers came from broken homes, came from families where there had been a divorce. And so Gen Xers began to do it themselves. Came home, put the Hot Pocket in the microwave myself, right? Got homework done on their own, managed their time on their own. So Gen Xers became very, very independent, and you'll see that play out, as we just said, in the member groups. The other piece of that happened at the same time has to do with efficiency. When Gen Xers were growing up, these old spaghetti westerns with Clint Eastwood, okay, now they were already old at that time. They were like 20 or 30 years old then. Went through this surge of popularity. And demographers were looking at this going, what is it with Clint Eastwood? And his poster was up in dorm rooms all over when Gen Xers were in school. What do you think it was about Clint Eastwood that spoke to Xers? In the old spaghetti westerns, yes. I'm sorry, independence. I'll do it myself, thank you very much. I'll come into town alone with my skill set. I'll get her done. I'm not going to get organized. I'm not going to like you guys. I'm just going to get it done. And this guy just spoke. He was an icon for this generation. So when you're working with and trying to attract Gen Xers, you want to remember that they may want to do it themselves, and that the volunteer options you may want to offer them are very much independent options. Not necessarily doing it alone, but letting them choose among different options. Letting them understanding that there are, if you're working with this generation, multiple ways of getting it done. When we look at what people give, I work with a lot of nonprofits, and when we're talking about asking people to contribute both time or money, Gen Xers overwhelmingly say, if I can see a direct impact, I'll give. If I can't, I'm not going to do it. Gen Xers are not going to pay to keep the lights on. They don't want to do so much the backroom work because they may not believe in the institution or the group, the member group. They've seen groups and institutions fail. But give them a specific task, a specific impact, an immediate impact, and they will then respond more easily. Why do you think Mikey was so popular during this time? This ad came out that ran for 11 years, which was an amazing thing. And the parents of Gen Xers went, yep, that's Mikey. What is it about Mikey that makes us think about Gen Xers? Yeah. But did he believe it was going to be good? No. You had to prove it to him. Again. And again. And again. So that was Mikey stood for that Gen Xer. The other thing about this generation that I just mentioned in passing was efficiency. I like to point to 1978 because that is when the first information became available, everyday information became available in a digital form. And then everything changed. The pace of life just picked up. The pace of change just picked up. If you were going to put a graph of the change on this, it would look like a hockey stick. It'd go along and then it would go straight up like this, and it didn't look bad because of technology. The pace of life accelerated. Gen Xers were in the middle of this. They were growing up feeling that pressure of the pace of life, and they became, as a result, very efficient. Now, if I come to the group meeting and we're going to plan an event, and I'm a boomer, am I going to want to chat for a while? Yeah, of course. That's how we get it done. It's face to face. I want to chat. Find out about your kids, all that stuff. The Xer walks in. Do they want to chat? Get it done. Cut to the chase. This is a get it done generation. I work with, there was a guy who did my new website recently. And every time we would meet to work on the website, we would meet because I'm a boomer. I would say, how are your kids? He's an Xer. And he'd tell me how his kids were, but that'd be it, right? So one time we were meeting, at the end of the meeting, I said, Rob, would you miss it if I didn't ask about your kids? And he goes, And I said to him, but I would miss it. But I would miss it. He needs to understand that as a boomer, I want to relate to him in that way for some of the time. I don't want to slow down the process. I want to help him get the work done. But I'm going to work more easily with him if we do a little bit of that chat. And Xers need to remember that about boomers. And boomers need to remember this about Xers, that it's efficient. It's part of their work ethic to be efficient. That comes from a very good place. They'll get the work done and get it done quickly. In fact, the new as this generation came along, then the new definition of success became time. Control over your time. Getting things done efficiently. Which moves us to where Gen Xers are today. Right now, the Gen Xers are the official sandwich generation. More than 50% of the Xers in the room, how many of you have kids who are still financially dependent and parents who are 65 or older? Right in the middle. Anybody here? How many Xers? We had some Xers in the room. Yeah. More than 50% of Xers are feeling that squeeze, and also you're in mid-career. Those years when you're going to position or not. Yes, what were you, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I just, sometimes, because I'm at the very end of Gen X, I feel like I have a lot in common with the Millennials. So
Yes.
I see some things that are me, but.
Oh, you just identified yourself as a cusper. You just outed yourself. Yeah, now you're out. I'm sorry. Okay, here, yes.
I was once at a Peace Corps event where a guy who had served in the 60s but then also served as a country director in the early 2000s commented that when he joined the Peace Corps, he joined to bring world peace. And he was disappointed in the volunteers that he organized because they seemed to want to get some sort of professional gain out of being the Peace Corps.
Absolutely. He was a boomer. He wanted, world peace. No big deal. We'll do it, right? Xers said, wait a minute, let's get real. Xers had no jobs at home. If you were growing up as an Xer, the people he was organizing, then if you were an Xer and you came out of college, some years there were jobs. But go to the career fair the next year, there's nobody there. It's like being on the tip of an Arctic moon. There's no job. And you had seen a whole generation, 7 million people while you were growing up, 7 million people every year laid off as the industrial complex in the country failed. Okay? So Xers said, yeah, I'll go to the Peace Corps because it might help me gain some skills. It might help me survive for a couple of years while I figure out how to survive this roller coaster of an economy. Another thing that was happening for Xers was the whole thing with globalization happening. And so the economies that we had depended on were no longer there for Xers. Yes, it's very real. Now at the same time, if an Xer joined the Peace Corps, he or she was still out to do something worthwhile in the world. The value was still there, but the situation was vastly different for Xers than it was for Boomers. Yeah, that's very real. And do you see that in your group? That it's easy for Boomers to look at Xers as kind of mercenary?
We don't have any boomers on our board right now.
How'd you do that? How'd you get rid of us? I want to
They just don't want to hang out.
Well, you know, and do you wish you had some in the, do you have them in the group? Yes.
We have some in the group, but they're not on the board.
And you know, Boomers, there's a role for everybody. That idealism still needs to be there. But it's interesting that your board has already sequenced into leadership of X. But in a lot of businesses that I work in, the leadership is already X. Not in as many nonprofits that I work in. Yes, there was a comment there. Oh, you want to trade? You could give her some Boomers?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll see you a Boomer and raise you an Xer. Yes. There was a comment here.
Adding on to her comment, because we're coming from the same group, I'm now a board member, but I was on that group, and we were mostly Gen X. Actually, a couple Gen X, now it's more Millennials. But what brought out all the generations was the 50th anniversary of that.
Yeah.
And it was actually, I think, more successful in that way, and it was actually very fascinating to be able to work across generations. It was the first time we saw all the differences.
Isn't it?
And it was very fascinating.
When it happens, it's so exciting. When it happens, it's wonderful, and you see the differences, and everybody's bringing their gifts to the table. And the Xers are bringing their efficiency to the table, and the Boomers are bringing that visionary piece to the table, and the Millennials are bringing those networks that work and get it done. Man, it is exciting. That's what we're all after. But we have to, it's about balance, isn't it? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Are there any trends out there for Gen Xers about childless by choice?
Yes.
I'm childless by choice, and I have a lot of Gen X friends that are childless by choice.
Yes. Millennials too, leading edge millennials. It is a trend among Xers. Now, I'm not childless by choice, but Xers are tending to marry, just marrying later. And the interesting thing about Xers is when you study Xers, you find that their commitment to spouses and partners is terrifically high. And they are already staying married longer. Boomers, we've had a problem with divorce, and it continues. We invented it, and we just support it. There's a big trend among Boomers for gray divorce. You know, it just goes on and on. Xers Xers are very committed to spouses and partners, very committed to that family unit. Now, that's one reason that what Xers need from us is their time. Their priority is their family. It doesn't matter how great your member group is or how great any nonprofit is that they belong to, their priority is their family. If you're working with Boomers, you got to remember the Boomer probably wants a little of your time, a little of that FaceTime, a little of that chat. The Xer doesn't. The Xer wants his or her time back so they can take it home. Now, they're there. They're there for the socializing. They're there for the mission. They want to be there, but you've got to be conscious of, respectful of their time. That's why if you're going to have a meeting and you say to the Boomer, come to the meeting, the Boomer's going to think, look at my calendar, see if I can come. Yeah, that's compliments. Of course you need me there, right? Of course we got to do it face to face. You ask an Xer to come to the meeting. The Xer will look at his calendar, but he or she may be thinking, okay, could I sit at my computer and listen in? Because see, that's more respectful of the Xer's time. The Xer's not being disrespectful about the meeting. The Xer's just trying to work with you and work efficiently. Make sense? So to give them time. Give them lots of options because they're individuals. Limited scale measurable outcomes. Again, don't tell them world peace. Extras are like, yeah, right. Tell them, let's put shoes on these people. These specific people. Again, measurable, small outcomes where the extra can have a direct impact. That's what we need. Don't tell them, support the member group by doing this kind of nebulous bookkeeping kind of thing. No, say get this done, this one specific piece, and the extra then will respond. Again, transparency. Extras have seen so many things fail. You never want to withhold information. No news means no, must be bad news to the extra. So you want to share all the information just as transparently as you possibly can. Again, diminishing bureaucracy, keeping it simple, keeping it efficient, in other words. Make sense? Yes. Anytime you have a period in history that is a part of an unraveling, where institutions erode and individuals rise, then it's followed by a period of crisis, which leads us to the millennial generation. What kind of crises did the millennials face growing up? What felt like a crisis? Millennials, what felt like a crisis?
September 11th.
Clearly, September 11th. Happened at a time when you were in your most formative years. Happened at a time when you're determining how you feel about the world and what can be done in the world and whether or not the world works for you. 9/11. What else?
Y2K.
Y2K. Yeah. What else?
I remember the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yes. Massive sweeping change. Environmental issues, right? If you're a millennial, you didn't grow up when you thought you don't remember thinking the environment was going to be okay. You never thought that. Yes.
The recession.
The recession. Not just the recession.
I'll ask.
Exactly. See, that's the point. Ever since millennials were born, the economy has been in crisis one way or another. Millennials, well, a lot of you were in, say, elementary school when the dot-com bubble happened. Dot-com bubble. That was huge. Had massive. Then the tailspin of the global economy after 9/11. Maybe you were in high school then. You get out of college and go into the workplace. What's happening? Recession of 2007. Yeah. Highest unemployment rates among this group since the Great Depression are now. Millennials have been more underemployed and unemployed than any other group that we've seen since that period of the 1930s. So, grounded in crisis. Millennials are a funny bunch, though. Your response to crisis has been what? Despair? Despair? No. What's your response? Create. Totally. I love that word. Create. Fix it. Let's fix it. First volunteers in after 9/11, first people who got organized, who was it? Millennials. First people after the tsunami in Southeast Asia, who got online and got it organized? Millennials. Millennials' response has been very practical. On the ground, flying low, let's fix it. Interesting group. Interesting group, and a group that I have a lot of admiration for that reason. Because you've grown up in the face of incredible change and incredible problems, but you just set out to fix it. Can you guys, how'd you do that? How'd you learn that? What?
Just maximizing the resources. Like I really admire it. Like I learned so much from the millennial
Yeah.
group. Like I guess I'm a cusper. I'm 79, so.
Okay. You don't look 7. Oh, you mean born in 79. Let me say a word about cuspers. Anybody else here? We got a couple who've confessed. Okay, other people you feel like you're
Cusp boomer.
boom/X. Might be some boom/silence in here too. In any case, if you got 1 foot in one generation, 1 foot in the other generation, there's good news for you. Because research tells us that cuspers, people who are in the middle, are natural leaders. You often rise to places of prominence because you're very good at mediating, very good at translating, very good at seeing more than one perspective. Born sort of in that gate hinge of change. Yeah, so if you are a cusper, I think you should make use of it. Put it on your resume. You could say you're generationally bilingual or something like that. You're all bilingual already, so just add one more. So yeah, cuspers are a good thing. And it's interesting, you may see on your boards and in your groups that customers are people who bring the group together, because that's just the time of history when they were born, when they could see a couple of major trends or major eras and stand between the two. Okay, so born in crisis, but the response has always been practicality. One of the most successful, absolutely most successful groups that appealed to millennials was Teach for America. It was huge for many years, and look at how practical. What they emphasized was, it's a solvable problem. Just do this little piece of it. Responding with practicality. As a matter of fact, millennials, if you survey millennials, ridiculously optimistic. 79% of them say, yeah, I'm working for a group, or I'm going to work for a group that has a positive impact on society. 65% of them say, no, I don't just want the world to be a better place. I am personally responsible for making the world a better place. They don't do it like boomers did it. They don't do it like Xers do it. But they do feel that power and that call and that imperative. So if we look back at the generations, we see this. We see a generation that said, yeah, there's a standard way of doing things. We see a generation that said, yeah, there's an ideal or a right way of doing things. And we see a generation that says, maybe there are multiple ways, individual ways, multiple ways of doing things. And then you get a generation who say, what's the impact? There's a practical way of doing things. Those are key words here. Those are key words. A standard way of doing things, a right way of doing things, multiple ways of doing things, and a practical way. What's the impact? A practical way of doing things. You'll see that played out in your group. I can say that with confidence because we see it played out everywhere. If you're on a committee anywhere, if you're in a working group anywhere, it doesn't matter. You'll see those differences played out. Something else we know about this generation, of course, is just how digital, and that's come up before. That digital component, that access to information all their lives, makes them also immediate. They really like and expect to be able to respond, not next month, not next year, but to be able to respond. The Peace Corps has picked up on this by sending people in immediately after like hurricanes like Katrina and stuff, with faster response projects, those crisis projects. And that's a terrific response to the millennial group that wants to respond more quickly. And again, it's that practical question that millennials ask. Will it work? There was I want to illustrate that practicality with a PSA that played about drug use when millennials were growing up. And a lot of millennials said to me, that was so powerful. That shaped I'll never forget that ad. And so the millennials in the group, you probably will remember this ad. It really worked for this generation. I want you to think about why.
Our teacher tells us just say no. Policemen said the same thing. They should walk home through here. Because the dealers don't take no for an answer.
To Kevin Scott and all the other kids who take the long way home, we hear you. Don't give up.
That's not exactly teach the world to sing. It's more like on the ground, yeah, it's bad. There's crisis. Let's do what we have to do. This really spoke at a visceral level to that generation. So you never want to try to sell pie in the sky ideals to this generation. You want to sell what can we do on the ground today, which isn't natural for you guys. Okay, so the other thing about millennials, and we have touched on this, is how highly collaborative they are. Teachers and parents for all those years taught millennials that they had a voice, that they were supposed to have a voice in decision making. I mean, think about the cell phone and what it did to parenting millennials, right? Millennials in the room, how old were you when you got your cell phone? 10? 15? They made you wait. Yeah, the millennial, my daughter said, I'm on the corner of Chicago, I'm at my desk here in Nashville, and I'm on the corner of Wellborn and, and I'm like, oh, so I'm looking up, because there's give and take. between the millennial parent and the kid. They're supposed to be. That's just the way, the time in history in which we lived, in which families were coming back together, which is part of those generational cycles. And millennials had a lot of give and take with parents. If you came home and you're a millennial and you're after curfew, I know none of you ever did that, but if you did, you know, that was probably, there were consequences, but was there also a conversation? A lot of boomer parents said, what led you to make that poor decision? You know, rather than just slamming in your. So there was give and take. That was the way that millennials grew up. Part of it was the technology, the internet and the phone that allowed that to happen. They come then to member groups expecting give and take and conversation, not that top-down model. Make sense? Yeah, and we've touched on this. So what do they want from you? That conversation, that seat at the table, creating those next-gen groups within your member groups so that they can think about what they need and come to you with that conversation of what they need and what they want in terms of socially and in terms of the mission. Again, looking at for-profit models because millennials take it for granted that business ought to do good, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. So you'll see that blurs in the millennial mind. Leveraging their networks, letting millennials organize things like flash mobs, flash giving, so that things happen fast. Because they have the networks, they have the social networks online to make it happen. So you don't have to plan the event 2 months out. You can make it happen in 3 days if you're a millennial. And accepting that, inviting that in. And then the other thing that probably will happen is, with your group is that you will depend less and less on the geography of your group, because millennials are in so many ways global. The first real global generation, and the Gen Edgers after them even more so. It's all about conversation. It's all about getting everybody to talk with you about what they want, what they need from the group, and hearing, taking the blinders off of their own generation just a little bit and hearing what other people are saying. I want to thank you. You're a great audience, and I appreciate the work that you have done and continue to do. And I really have enjoyed talking with you about those cantankerous generations as we all come together. Thank you.